For this video, I will be covering 4 different areas of grammar with a focus on basic sentence units and their common errors along with examples of how to explain them. The first section will be the independent clause, the second is the prepositional phrase, the third will be on the infinitive phrase, and the last is the adjective clause. The video is grammar oriented, and on the screen I have listed some terms that I will probably be using. So to start, the most basic common unit of English writing is the independent clause, which only needs a subject and a verb. Going back to that previous list, we can see that in all of these there's a subject and there's a verb. So each of these demonstrates that subject and verb unit pair. Furthermore, in this pattern, everything else is built up to support that subject or verb. So let's work with an example to show that idea. Let's say we start with a subject and verb pair like this. So that establishes our independent clause. We can basically expand on it by adding things like this, adjective and adverb. We can expand on it by adding something like an adjective clause. And we can expand on it by adding things like prepositional phrase and an infinitive. In this sentence pattern, what still remains though is our core unit, the subject and the verb. It's harder to find, but if we eliminate everything else, what we should be able to see is that that original subject and verb pair unit still exists. So why is it important that we know about this core subject plus verb unit pair? So let's imagine that a tutor came up to you and they gave you a sentence like this. The frightened dog that John walked past usually to its shed to hide. So for a person reading this, they won't know what the dog is actually doing because there's no longer a verb here. This whole phrase functions as a adjective essentially to describe the dog, but we still don't know what the dog's doing. We might expect something to happen over here, another verb. So maybe the frightened dog that John walked past usually to its shed to hide was very territorial and it bit him. But right now, as a reader, we don't know what the main idea is because there's no subject and verb unit pair. When you're dealing with 2T sentences, most of the time, if there's a subject plus verb unit pair missing, the meaning will be really confusing. And also in terms of the sentences that you get, chances are they won't be this grammatically clean. Alright, so now that the core subject plus verb unit has been established, let's move on to error patterns within that core unit. Most of the examples I'm working with are fairly simple, but 2Ts will propagate these errors when they create longer sentences. Since we're operating on the subject plus verb level, the type of errors that occur generally will prevent the subject plus verb pair from appearing, and what that means is that the errors will revolve around word forms. So what a duty is trying to use as a subject or verb is in a different form than it should be. So here's the first example. Write good papers is important. So what's going on in this sentence? In this sentence, there's basically no subject, and that can be figured out by breaking down the word forms. So we have a verb, an adjective, a noun, a linking verb, and another adjective. So when we look at this, we can tell that there's no subject. And when you tell that to a tutor, what you can do instead of telling them directly is you can ask them a question. Well, what is the subject in your sentence? Depending on how they respond, you might give them different explanations. So for example, if they respond and say that, well, this is actually my subject, I'm trying to use this as my subject, then you can go ahead and give them the first explanation. The first explanation is the gerund explanation. And a gerund is basically a verb that functions as a noun. So this is literally what you could be telling them. And to show this, what you can do is give them 2 examples. I sing often. Singing is fun. And when you give these 2 sentences, break it down. Well, in this sentence, this is clearly my subject. This is the action that they're doing. and this is just an adverb. In the second sentence, well, this is clearly my subject, and this is definitely my verb, and this is just an adjective. So when you do it this way, you give them this noun, and it's a pretty common noun, so they should probably know it. When you do it this way, they should recognize that, okay, in this form, this is functioning as a verb. In this form, this is functioning as a noun, which can be a subject in a sentence. Now, when you show this to them, have them apply it to their own sentence. And when you do that, this is what should happen. They should be able to figure out that, okay, I can't use this. Instead, what I should be using is this. And in the end, what should happen is they come up with this sentence. So what they've done, and you can explain this to them, is they've created a gerund. This gerund forms a gerund phrase, and that gerund phrase now acts as a subject in this type of sentence pattern. Now, if they give you a different response to that question, let's say they said, oh, I forgot to put in my subject, then you go into a different explanation, and this explanation uses this sentence pattern, which is based on the list concept. So to explain this, I'll give an example like this. I drink soda, I eat pizza. So I'll introduce them to two sentences, and I'll explain that if the subjects are the same in this, what you can do is you can do something like this. And this should look familiar to them. And so the end result of doing this is you end up with a sentence like this. Drink soda and eat pizza. Now, at this point, what you can do is you can ask them, are you saying something like this? Are you saying he writes good papers? And are you saying he is important? Now, if that is what they're saying, then go ahead and have them do the same thing. Have them go through the process of creating that sentence, and in the end, what should happen is they come up with this sentence. He writes good papers and is important. So this second concept is based off of the list idea, which is actually something pretty important. So let's move on to our second example. Timmy writing often. Breaking down the word forms, we get a noun, we have a participle, and we have an adverb. So in this sentence, this Timmy could function as our subject, but writing by itself cannot function as a verb. So what you could ask the tutor then is, what is the verb, or where is the verb in your sentence? And if they respond to you that, oh, I'm using writing as my verb, then you can go ahead and start asking them some leading questions. The first thing you can ask them is, what tense are you doing? And if they respond, well, I'm doing the continuous tense, you can ask them, well, which continuous tense? Which continuous tense? And at this point, they should realize that they're missing an indicator. And if they don't, you can ask them, well, do you need to use a linking verb to indicate this when you're doing the continuous form? And that linking verb indicates which tense they're doing. Are they saying Timmy is? Or are they saying Timmy was writing? Or are they saying Timmy will be writing? So for this error, it's relatively minor, but having something like a verb tense grid on hand helps to give them a diagram of, well, what they should be doing. And you'll notice that in these patterns, they're missing that linking verb, depending on whether they're doing the continuous or the perfect continuous. Now, let's say the 2D gives a different response, and they say that, in fact, I am not using this as a verb. Well, what that means then is that somewhere over here, they're still missing a verb that will go with this subject. And what's happening in this sentence right now is they're using this as a participle phrase. So let me give an explanation of the participle phrase. The participle is kind of similar to the gerund. Basically, instead of turning a verb into a noun, it turns that verb into an adjective. So a really great verb to explain this idea with is bores. So let's start with this sentence. He bores them. In this case, bores is functioning as a verb. Now, if we shift over to the next sentence, he is bored, that's a description of him. So in this sentence pattern, bored is functioning as an adjective. Now, with the participles, sometimes you can have a past participle or a present participle, and that's when it can get confusing for some students. So here, we have one functioning as an adjective, he is boring to the audience, and one functioning as a verb, he is boring the audience. And on top of this confusion, sometimes students will get confused with the ed and ing forms when it comes to different words. So they might be trying to say that a person is boring, but they might say that the person is bored. And on top of this, the participle also forms phrases. So you can have something such as this and this, a past participle phrase and a present participle forming that phrase. Alright, so let's say we tell the tutor that the verb is missing and they end up creating a sentence that now has a verb and in this case an object. So this sentence in terms of word forms, Timmy writing often has used up many pens, is perfectly fine. However, when you're using the participle phrases, sometimes you need to set commas around them. And this has to deal with an idea of like restriction or subordination. And to get this across, I'm going to do this example down here. So in this sentence, the person writing the story knows her. Writing the story forms a participle phrase. And the way to figure out whether the meaning of a sentence is restricted or subordinated, whether the participle phrase is subordinated, is by rearranging the sentence. So take the participle phrase, put it at the front. Writing the story, the person knows her. When we rearrange the sentence that way, the meaning of it changes completely. Now, in this original one, when we look at the participle phrase and we rearrange it to the front, writing often, Timmy has used up many pens, meaning of it doesn't change at all. The only difference is just the placement of the participle phrase. So this top case is a case where it's not subordinated or restricted, and because of that, we have to put 2 commas around it. So here's the third example, writing good papers. So let's break down the word forms. So this is a participle, this is an adjective, and this is noun. So this could be functioning as your noun phrase. So basically when you break down the word forms, well, you have a fragment sentence. And what you probably want to ask them is, okay, what is your subject and verb? If they respond that this is functioning as their subject, then let them know that they need a verb. If they say they don't know, what you might need to tell them then is that by itself, what they've created is a phrase, and it needs to be attached to some sort of subject and verb. A third possible explanation in this case is maybe they're trying to do the imperative, and all that is something like this. Write good papers. So it's a command, basically, and when you do the command, you just use the base form of the verb plus what you want them to do. So base form of the verb plus what they should be doing. For the fourth example, what I'm trying to show is that there are many different potential meanings a tutor might have given what they've written. To show this, I've created 6 different interpretations along with their grammatical formulations. So when a tutor tells you, oh, just fix my grammar, well, grammar and meaning are sometimes intertwined. So now that I've covered the core subject plus verb unit, I want to talk about some of the supporting units. The first unit I want to talk about is the prepositional phrase. And the prepositional phrase is formed from the combination of a preposition plus a noun. From there, other stuff can be built around to support it, just like in the core unit. So an example of that might be this, after the lunch. So in this prepositional phrase, this is our preposition, after, and our noun or noun phrase will be the lunch. So if we wanted to expand upon it, we can do something like add an adjective and attach an adjective clause to it. But what remains consistent is after the lunch, the core part of that prepositional phrase. So this holding will become our prepositional phrase. And what's different about the prepositional phrase is that by itself, it is a fragment. So right now, this is a fragment. And to fix it, basically, you would have to attach it to like a subject plus verb unit, which is our independent clause. So some of the other ways that the prepositional phrase can function in a sentence is can attach to a verb. So I dream of success. In the first way, we were just using it to introduce a sentence, so it's the same as this example. In this one, this prepositional phrase is attached to a noun, and in this case, the noun just happens to be the subject. In this fourth case, it's pretty much a rewrite of that second case. The only difference is it's in the middle, and we kind of treat it like the participle phrase in the middle, depending on whether it's restricted or unrestricted. In this last case, the prepositional phrase can also function as a subject. So to the left is the fountain. So for our first example, we have Timmy writes about corrupt. So let's go ahead and break down the word forms. We have a noun, we have a verb, preposition, and we have an adjective. So the first part's fine. It forms our core unit, the subject plus verb. But the problem is actually in the prepositional phrase. So by definition, that preposition needs a noun to go with it. And right now, corrupt is functioning as an adjective. So at this point, what you want to do with the tutor is you want to ask them if they're trying to use corrupt as a noun, and if they are, whether they're referencing people, action, or an activity. So for the first explanation, if they respond that they're using corrupt and referring to people with it, it actually fits into a larger picture. And that larger picture is that you can use adjectives to refer to people, but only if you use a specifier such as the or one of the possessive pronouns in front of it. So let's work with a really famous example. Give me you're tired, you're weary, and whatever else goes with it. So in this example, tired and weary are functioning as nouns. But what happens if you remove the specifier? Give me tired, weary. When you remove that specifier, the your in this, what's left is tired and weary. And when a reader reads it, what they expect to follow is a noun. So now these are functioning as adjectives. But in the original sentence, when you have that specifier in front of it, it'll function as a noun. Similarly, if we replace that your with another specifier such as the, give me the tired, the weary, it goes back to functioning as a noun. Even though it's an adjective, it is currently functioning as a noun. So the main idea for this first explanation is, yes, you can use an adjective as a noun, but it needs that specifier in front of it. For the second explanation, if they respond that they're trying to use corrupt as a verb, then all that really needs to happen is they need to transform it into the gerund form so that they have a noun. So the second explanation is when you have a preposition plus a verb, that verb becomes the ing form. So in this example, it might become Timmy writes about corrupting something like, I don't know, the political process. So to test this out, you can try it with any other prepositions that you can think of. So maybe things like of, play, so of playing. So the best part of playing is something. For sing becomes for singing. At dance becomes at dancing. So main idea for this is anytime you have a preposition plus a verb, that verb will probably be transformed into the ing form. For the third explanation, if they're referring to corrupt as the idea, you can just introduce them to the noun form. So it's just as simple as saying Timmy writes about corruption. And generally when there's a noun form of a word, it'll be the preferred form versus something like the gerund form. But they do have different uses and different meanings. For the fourth explanation, if they're using corrupt as an adjective, go ahead and give them the definition of a prepositional phrase and just let them know, well, since you have an adjective, all you really need to do is add a noun after that. So the fourth one is just them completing the prepositional phrase. And to do this, maybe you can give them a parallel example. So maybe there's a sentence out there like this. John writes about happy what? So in this parallel example, they just need to fill in this part of it with a noun. And happy is a fairly common adjective, so they should understand. For the second example, we have Timmy writes about politicians expose corruption. So the word forms are already broken down, but let's try to see how this might fit into a common sentence pattern. So Timmy will probably function as a subject. This will be our verb. That means that the rest of this, since it begins with a preposition, chances are it's going to form a prepositional phrase. So we have the preposition, and what generally follows is the object of the preposition. And then we have a verb and another object. So the problem is actually over here with the object and verb. Usually objects will not have an active verb. So to illustrate this idea, I'm going to use this sentence. The man found the dog. So in this sentence pattern, the man is the subject, the verb is found, and the object is the dog. What that means though is if we try to add another verb after here, it would sound like this. The man found the dog barks. And that does sound kind of weird. The reason why it sounds weird is at least for this starting verb, at least for found, we don't have the object coming with an active verb. There are some exceptions to this, so you can have something like they made him eat, but they fall into a certain group of verbs. So made, I had him eat, I let him eat, I helped him eat, watched him eat. All of these, and there are probably a few more that I haven't listed, but these are kind of the exception to that rule. So if you're working with a tutor and this type of problem pops up, you can ask leading questions. If they don't know what the problem is, you can point them to like the section where the problem is existing. So you can point them towards the prepositional phrase, and if they still don't get it, you can point towards the object-verb relationship. And if they still don't get it, at that point you will need to go through the explanation about objects and verbs. But once you do that explanation, you can probably give them several different options for correcting the issue. So earlier I said something about active verbs. So what you could do then is deactivate the verb. And there are three different ways of deactivating the verb. In the first way, what you could do is you can transform it into a participle. So just change it into the ing form. So this becomes exposing. So how the sentence reads now is Timmy writes about politicians exposing corruption. The second way is to change it into the infinitive form. So that just means to plus your verb, so to expose. So it reads Timmy writes about politicians to expose corruption. And then the third one is to do an adjective clause. So that would sound something like this. Timmy writes about politicians who expose corruption. So three different solutions at least. And for the last two, the infinitive and the adjective clause, I'll be covering those later. So all three solutions revolve around the problem with the object-verb relationship. And in the first two, they change it so that these are no longer functioning as verbs. In the last one, it changes what that verb is attached to. For our third example, we have at the coffee shop sells donuts. So let's break down the forms. We have a preposition, we have the coffee shop, which will function as a noun phrase, we have sells as a verb, and we have a noun, donuts. So let's try to put this into possible sentence unit interpretations. Let's say that they did want to use this as a preposition. What that means then is we have a preposition which makes that noun phrase act as an object, and right now that object has a verb, and that verb itself also has an object. So basically this runs into the problem that was presented in the second example. And to correct that, what would need to happen is we would have to deactivate this verb. So let's say we do the ing correction. That means that what we might be reading this as then is at the coffee shop selling donuts. So this currently now functions as one gigantic prepositional phrase, but that introduces a new problem. Right now there's no subject plus verb unit. So adding in that subject plus verb unit would complete the sentence. So this presents one possible interpretation of what that given sentence might sound like. For the second interpretation, let's say that they did want to use at as their preposition. That means that, again, we have a preposition and we have an object, the coffee shop, right after it. But let's say that they also intended to use the verb as an active verb. So let's keep it in an active form, and then it also has an object after that. So if they did intend to use it as an active verb, well, you can ask them, what's the subject that goes with that verb? And this actually gives the second interpretation. Basically what they're saying is something like, at the coffee shop, somebody sold a donut. For the third interpretation, let's say that they intended to use the coffee shop as a subject. So that means that the pattern they're following then is the coffee shop is functioning as a subject, sells is functioning as a verb for that to form the subject plus verb core unit, and donuts is just going to be the object. So right now there's a preposition in front of it, and that preposition is actually the problem. So it's as simple as just removing it. So when this happens, basically all they're really saying is the coffee shop sells donuts. So another major supporting unit for the independent clause is the infinitive phrase, and it's kind of similar to the prepositional phrase. So to is a pretty common preposition, such as I went to the store, but it also functions in a second way, which is in the infinitive form, which is a to plus verb, and we can use that in several ways. So just take a look at the three examples that I've created over here. So it can basically function as a noun, an adjective, or an adverb. And there are also some pretty common sentence patterns for how these are used.
For the first example, we have, I hope to meeting you. I have already broken down the word forms and given two possible sentence patterns, but I think that this method isn't effective here because this is more of a vocabulary-based problem. Certain verbs, nouns, and adjectives can be used with the to as an infinitive, others can be used with it as a preposition, and some can be used in either form. So, as an example, we have this original sentence, I hope to meet you. And as a second example, I look forward to meeting you. So this issue can be looked at in three different ways. I'll give a brief explanation of those. The first classification is with phrasal verbs, which is usually a verb plus adverb combination or a verb plus preposition combination. And for us, that verb plus preposition is more important since sometimes that preposition can be a to. So here are some examples of phrasal verbs. So what you'll notice is that there's a verb and there's a to. But in these cases, that to is functioning as a preposition, so therefore what follows is that gerund, which gives us that noun, which is the object of that preposition. Now, even with these verbs, sometimes these verbs can function with also the infinitive form. So as an example, let's take that same verb objected and try to use it with infinitive. They objected to delay them. So in this case, this is clearly functioning as infinitive to, not the preposition to. And just to be more complete, another example of that, they objected to delaying them. That is an example of where the preposition, or where to is functioning as that preposition. So essentially what it boils down to is vocabulary and sometimes to meaning. The second classification is with adjectives, and sometimes the to can function as a preposition with adjectives. So here are some examples of that. He was indifferent to pleading. So it follows the same pattern as in the previous example. The to here is functioning as your preposition. So we have that same object of the preposition, which is a verb that's been transformed into the gerund, therefore a noun, therefore can function as an object. But even with these examples, sometimes that to can also function as a infinitive. So these are some examples of that. So therefore, once again, it kind of comes down to a tutee's knowledge of vocabulary. The third classification is with nouns. Some nouns you can use to as a preposition, as in these, and in others you're restricted to the infinitive. So basically, once again, it comes down to vocabulary. For the second example, we have, to meet you, I would drive 100 miles. So all of the word forms are fine in this. The problem is actually related to the infinitive phrase, and I like to fit it into a larger explanation. I call the explanation the introductory phrase, and basically it goes something like this. Whether you have a prepositional phrase, such as in the morning, whether you have a participle phrase, such as sitting at the table, or you have an infinitive phrase, such as to please the crowd, or transition like however, or an adverb, something that ends with a ly, such as quickly. If any of these phrases sit at the beginning of your sentence, chances are you're going to need a comma with it before your independent clause. So when I do this explanation, I do also like to point out one thing, and there's an exception with the word then, which is considered like a transition or an adverb, and also with the complex sentence structure. So if you're beginning with a complex or a subordinating conjunction, there won't be a comma before where the subject and verb are. For the third example, we have I would, to meet you, drive 100 miles. So once again, all the word forms are fine, but basically this follows the prepositional phrase sentence pattern. So let's jump back to that. So for the prepositional phrase patterns, which is covered earlier, basically all these can translate into infinitive phrase patterns. And so there are some examples of that. But basically in the example that we're working with, it pretty much follows this sentence pattern. So in order to fit that into that sentence pattern, basically what's needed is a comma here and a comma here. Usually when I'm explaining this, I just let them know that if it sits at the front, you probably need a comma at the beginning. If it sits somewhere in the middle, whether it's here or here or here, it probably needs a double comma. And if it's sitting at the end, it probably doesn't need a comma at all. For the third example, we have I would, to meet you, drive 100 miles. So once again, all the word forms are fine, but basically this follows the prepositional phrase sentence pattern. So let's jump back to that. So for the prepositional phrase patterns, which is covered earlier, basically all these can translate into infinitive phrase patterns. And so there are some examples of that. But basically in the example that we're working with, it pretty much follows this sentence pattern. So in order to fit that into that sentence pattern, basically what's needed is a comma here and a comma here. Usually when I'm explaining this, I just let them know that if it sits at the front, you probably need a comma at the beginning. If it sits somewhere in the middle, whether it's here or here or here, it probably needs a double comma. And if it's sitting at the end, it probably doesn't need a comma at all. The last grammatical unit I will be covering is the adjective clause, which is also known as the relative clause. It functions like an adjective and basically combines two or more sentences into one. There are three general patterns with it, and knowing how they form and how to break it down helps with explaining it. On the screen there are 3 examples, and what you'll notice is that for the outer sentence, the first sentence, they're all the same, and that's just to simplify the example. So the reason why the first pattern is called the subject-based adjective clause is for the sentence that's transformed into the adjective clause, this sentence, the noun that matches and will be the reference is the subject of the original sentence. So what happens in this is you take the noun or the subject, you remove it, and you attach the relative pronoun, and this whole sentence now is moved up and sits next to the noun that it describes. In the second pattern, the noun that matches, same noun, is currently the object of that sentence, and so you do the same transformation. You take out the noun, you plug in the relative pronoun at the front, and now this whole unit is moved and attached to the noun that it describes. In the third example, the conceptual reference, the original sentence doesn't have any words that match up, but the whole idea refers back to the noun, and so all you do is you plug in your relative pronoun, and this whole phrase now attaches to describe that original noun. So let's move on to the first example. The dog that he bought food is sleeping. So I've already broken down the word forms and created a sentence pattern, but let's extract the sentence. So for the first sentence, the outer sentence, this is probably what it's going to be. The dog is sleeping. So let's check the grammar on the outer sentence. We have a subject and we have a verb. So the grammar in the outer sentence is actually perfectly fine. Now for the inner sentence, we have to think about how the adjective clause is constructed. So the first thing is that adjective clause is added at the end. So let's remove that. Now the second thing is there should be something that's common between them. There should be some sort of reference. Now since there's a subject, the subject won't be the reference. That means that there should be another object back here that allow the adjective clause to describe the original noun, which is the dog. So this is what that sentence should look like. He bought food, the dog. Now let's grammar check this new sentence. We have a subject, a verb, object, and another object. So this is where the problem is happening. There are two objects being stuck together without some sort of connection. Now, one connection that could work here, we add a preposition to separate the two objects for. Now, when we apply this whole new adjective clause, or new sentence that'll form the adjective clause, this is what it'll sound like. The dog that he bought food for is sleeping. And so adding this preposition corrects the problem that was originally happening in the original adjective clause.
In our second example, we have the dog loudly barks that he dislikes. So I've already broken down the word forms and the likely sentence patterns, and so we find that we have two sentences. The first sentence is the dog loudly barks, and we have a second sentence which we have to reverse engineer. So following that process, we take off that and we take the subject of this sentence and make it the object in this one, and so what we have now is he dislikes the dog. And for each of these sentences, when we grammar check them, oops, this is an adverb, and they're both grammatically correct. So what's the actual issue with the sentence then? So it's actually a different issue. All it is when we use the adjective clause, we want to make sure that it sits next to what it's describing. So right over here. For the third example, I've already broken down the word forms and likely sentence units, and basically it's pretty clear what's happening. This subject lacks a verb, so basically all you need to do is point out that while there's a verb inside here, it goes with the adjective clause, and that means that the subject outside is still missing a verb that goes with it.